Okay, so probably I will start with a short introduction of our guest, and then we will start with our lecture. So today we gathered for the second webinar of Jean Monnet model, SEDEP. The full name is the European Union's Common Security and Defense Policy, Challenges Related to the War in Ukraine, which is supported by the European Commission and open to everyone who are interested in the issue, European Union issues. And today we are happy to welcome our guest, Associate Professor in Cyber Threats, Politics, Philosophy and International Relations, Tristan Stoddart. Tristan is an Associate Professor of Cyber Threats in the School of Social Sciences, as well as working with the Hillary Rodham Clinton School of Law. At Swansea, he is a member of the Cyber Threats Research Center. And today, our guest will talk about the Russians' hybrid warfare campaign against Ukraine from 2014. After Professor Stoddart's opening remarks, we will traditionally have a short discussion, which will be moderated by my colleague within the project, Associate Professor Lyudmila Vovchuk. Therefore, I will not take more time and would want to give the floor to our speaker, Professor Stoddart. So please, Chris, the floor is yours.
Yes, very kind of you, Elena. Can you put up my slides, please, someone? I just saw them appear.
Yeah, I think Margarita or Ludmila. Margarita, maybe you can try to share the presentation because actually, unfortunately, I don't have the option to open any PowerPoint files on my laptop right now.
Okay. Now I switch on this video and
okay.
You must say me
and we will
see or no. Yes, one moment. Can you see this video? Oh, not video, slideshow.
The presentation, yes.
Yes, yes.
Just maybe you can open it to the full size. Super.
Excellent.
Yeah, this is great. Yes, I think that we can start from this moment. Yes.
Super. I'm not going to go through these slides, this slide particularly, but like you, I had earlier funding as well from the Jean Monnet Fund. So we were looking at Western European resilience to hybrid warfare. This is kind of an evolution of it, but it's more based on my Russia book. I've got 3 books on the boil at the minute. One other on cyber warfare, which is published in 2022. So I'm drawing on that and my Russia book and some elements of my China book as well. The full titles are Russia's Hybrid Warfare Against the West. My cyber warfare book is Threats to Critical Infrastructure, and my China book is on Chinese cyber espionage. So I'm drawing on all those, in addition to which I sent around, and you're very well going to have a look at it, the article I did in Applied Internet, I think it's in Applied Internet Security in Governance, which was a lead article in the special issue on Ukraine, which was published in June. And that details in more depth what I can talk about today. Next slide, please. So one of the elements I'll talk about is it's not really on the conventional aspects. So I'll talk more on the unconventional, the cyber side aligned with the wider package of hybrid activities that hybrid warfare activities that Russia's been conducting for over a decade. One of the keys, potentially, and it's debatable, is the blunting of Russia's cyber offensive. One of the big questions I was asking the community of people I'm involved with in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, and I remember waiting and hoping it wasn't going to happen when I saw forces amassed in Belarus and then in the Donbass and from Crimea, that it just wouldn't happen. But when it did, I suspected it would be the first full-scale cyber war, but it didn't happen. And the why it didn't happen vexed me. And I started asking questions and then doing research. And it took time for that research to reach fruition and for some of the questions I had to be answered. Because there were sleeper agents, proxies, or privateer forces, and I talk about the privateer model separately, as well as collaborators who had told Russian intelligence handlers that Ukraine was weak and Russian forces would be welcomed as liberators. I also read Putin's, I'm not sure how to describe it, but his essay on Ukrainian statehood. And in that is clear denials of Ukrainian statehood and references to a failed state, amongst many other things as well. Allied to this background of thinking was a study by the Royal United Services Institute up in London, which, and the estimates vary, but their estimate, and they are very good, is that Russia was aiming for a blitzkrieg of around 10 days and to decapitate the leadership. Now, we know they did go after the leadership and they had teams out looking for Zelensky and his people, but they failed. Now, on the cyber side, I'll talk more in a second or two. Can you forward a slide, please? Russian intelligence gravely underestimated Ukraine's abilities and your will to resist. What they also were unaware of, and I do think they were unaware, is the enormous help that Ukraine had been provided with by Western intelligence and Western private industry in the months leading up to the invasion. That was allied with those highly politicized intelligence assessments. So on the intelligence side, he was believing that flowers would be put into the turrets of tanks and you'd be clapping and cheering. At the same time, the West was acutely aware of the gravity of the situation and of Ukraine's ability and capacity and want to resist. And they'd been on board, and that included sitting side by side with some members of your intelligence community. Some of that's the sort of foreground as well as some of the background. The deeper background, you will know it well. This is the prima facie case that the Kremlin presents, that Ukraine is in its sphere of influence, that it's run by Banderovsky, and it's attempting to denazify Ukraine. And in addition to which, and Putin was asked this week at the BRICS summit, or last week I should say, about why invade. And one of the issues he raised again was NATO EU enlargement. So this tallies with Euromaidan and the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. It also presents for Putin a challenge, his desire to challenge the liberal order and his fear, or the Kremlin's fear, of color revolutions, which for him was symbolized by Euromaidan. And just last week, too, in a question by Steve Rosenberg, a reporter from the BBC, he answered that Euromaidan was, in his view, a color revolution. Can we move forward a slide, please?
Next slide, yes?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay.
Just in case there's any confusion over color revolutions, they're largely named after political parties that have been putting up various colors and flags, but they are revolutions from below, but they lead to a change in regime. It happened with the Arab Spring in 2011, and it's happened periodically since like 1991, but even before then. So that's the reference to the color revolutions. In the preceding years, so from 2014 onwards and the annexation of Crimea, Russia was stepping up its support of pro-Russian separatists in the Donbass. It was also attempting to destabilize, both from within Ukraine and from without. This included through mainstream and increasingly social media-driven propaganda campaigns. These form a part of broader political military influence operations. It's been adept at clouding the picture with lawfare. That's a pretty well-established term in the hybrid warfare canon now. But it's using a legal pretext, which things like referendums, sham referendums, or election campaigns that aren't really elections, to paint a picture of legitimacy. They were also engaging in a series of direct interventions, and this is not exclusive to Ukraine. This has been right across the West, especially with a particular unit of the GRU, which has been implicated in lots and lots of destabilizing activities, a lot around NATO and European Union membership. As well as they were engaging with Russian-inspired or Russian-directed, and there are two slightly different things, and this is the lawfare side, military action. All of which in the East and as far as they could into and across Europe, deemed to foment nationalism, secessionism, and also to bolster Russian nationalism, particularly in the self-declared so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. I'm sad to say that Ukraine was really being used to test the limits. It's just Ukraine. Moldova has been another example. So was Georgia years before as well, to test the limits and responses to Russian actions. And this is felt across its near abroad, the old former Soviet states. But their activities are replicated and ripple out across 4 continents. I could talk to you in like different days, probably, about 47 separate cases of Russian political military influence campaigns. Ukraine, I'm afraid, was essentially the laboratory for Russian activities. Next slide, please. So let's zoom out for a second and theorize, not directly, and this is the second one about mirror imaging, what the Kremlin was thinking. Now, the part of the scene setting is in 4th generation warfare, and I'll talk about that more in the next slide. What I won't talk about, that I'll talk about here, is mirror imaging, and that's where you see your opposing side as you see yourself, with the same motivations, same goals, the same institutions, the same template, the same value system. That is a flawed way of conducting intelligence analysis, and that leads into hybrid warfare discussions. In the, I almost said Soviet, and in the Russian case, you've also got to consider, and excuse me if I butcher any words, I don't mean to, maskirovka, which is about masking or concealing intent and designs. Russia, I feel, has also borrowed from a number of Chinese theorems, particularly 1999's unrestricted warfare treaties, written by 2 Chinese colonels, in addition to which is acupuncture and paralysis warfare. And acupuncture and paralysis warfare is all about hitting the key nodes and paralysis points of the body politic. You've also got social psychological warfare. These are all Chinese concepts or theorems, which is about societal level and about shaking the foundations of the citizenry in terms of its trust in government and its trust of government institutions. Now, some see this as being fully articulated in the so-called Gerasimov doctrine. I'm sure I don't need to tell you who Valery Gerasimov is, but he was no theoretician. But there is a train of thought, and I will talk more about this, but that it's not so much an invention of one individual, but it is a fairly good representation of Russian thinking on a whole range of hybridized issues, from political military influence campaigns and through destabilization attempts. But it borrows from each of these above concepts, so unrestricted warfare, acupuncture and paralysis warfare, social cycle, and it reaches back into Soviet active measures campaigns, which is where you're very much on the intelligence side, you know, the old KGB, now GRU, FSB, SVR. The modern world as well is changed. It's changed because we're so integrated with technology. We've become a high dependency, but also high vulnerability society because of our use and sometimes misuse of technology embodied by the internet. And that is that's one of the key enablers for hybrid warfare. And I do apologize, but gibbrannau of one year. Next slide, please. Oh, just one other thing. Why I've got the Lewis Carroll slide up is, if you're ever familiar with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass, it's a dystopian reality. And Russia's sort of operating within its own reality, but it's trying to import that into the social layer and socio-political layer of the societies it targets, including Ukraine. But in addition to which is the cyber does this as well. It's so fast moving and it crosses all four domains of traditional warfare. So it's land, sea, air, space, and now cyber is the fifth domain. And it produces that sort of running to stand still mentality. And this is a conversation that Alice had with the Red Queen of you have to run twice as fast to stand still in this place. Russia's been fairly adept. It's also got its own vulnerabilities, but it's been fairly adept at managing its own information space, but at the same time exploiting the open societies of Ukraine, its neo-abroad, and the West more widely, as well as sub-Saharan Africa. And that's why that slide is there. I find it an interesting conversation to have, but I'll move on. The next slide, please. Unfortunately, this is where I have a video, and the video would draw on H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, which is not about alien destruction so much. If you read the book, it's more about what happens to societies when they're faced with existential threat and how the knots that bind us unbind and people become more self-interested because they're protecting themselves, their loved ones and their families. But that binding is there still and is so strong. But this is where an external force is also manipulating that socio-political fabric. And that's why that's there. Unfortunately, I don't have a video to show you. And it would give me a chance to rest my voice as well, but never mind. Next slide, please. Hybrid warfare stretches back to antiquity. Thucydides wrote about it in the massive volume, History of the Peloponnesian War. It's not a pitched battle anymore of two clearly identifiable enemies, uniformed soldiers on an open battlefield. It's where counterinsurgency campaigns, nationalism, terrorism can be combined to blur the lines. This is also a feature of unrestricted warfare. This was written and read a lot within the PLA and the Chinese Communist Party. They've also met and talked with their Russian counterparts through a wide variety of forums. But that blurring of the lines is a key aspect of hybrid warfare. And it sets or discusses a series of activities in the so-called grey zone of hostility beneath the legal definition of conventional warfare. And it is a contested space legally as well as politically. It is essentially a political decision about what is war. So many of the wars that we kind of think of as wars post-World War II have actually been undeclared wars. This includes Vietnam, this includes the two Gulf Wars. They're under UN, the Korean War as well. They're under UN mandate. It doesn't matter to the people involved. War is war. But from a legal point of view, that's that conversation about warfare. In the hybridized world as well, it also blurs the distinction between competence and non-competence, as well as between state, non-state, as well as sub-state actors. And this is where plausible deniability comes in, and the lack of uniforms and uniform personnel, and the role intelligence services play. Next slide, please. In the West, there were a number of scholars who are worth talking about, not at length. You can read this for yourself, so I'm happy to discuss it. William Lind was probably the first in the West in 1989 to talk about the move towards hybridized forms of conflict, although this was really in a sort of counterinsurgency, small wars context. Martin van Creveld was really the first to refocus on these dynamics. And it was, again, a discussion about so-called low-intensity warfare, which at the time, at the end of the Cold War, he saw as the last gasp of large-scale conventional warfare and the rise of non-Trinitarian Clausewitzian warfare. We'll talk about the Clausewitzian Trinity as we go along. Then you have, probably more famously, at least for an American audience, Frank Hoffman, who, again, with maybe some more clarity, but probably more of a case of more of a catchword, that he characterized this as fourth generation warfare, 4GW. We could talk about what the three others are, but this is where you're into revolutions of military affairs and the advent of firing at distance. The last big, widely recognized revolution is the advent of nuclear weapons. But 4GW is where state and non-state actors utilize means including terrorism as well as information to undermine the will of the existing state, to delegitimize it, and to stimulate an internal social breakdown. I'm afraid to say that is widely in evidence in Russian activities across a wide geographic spectrum, and of course very much centered upon Ukraine. Hoffman saw merit in 4GW, but he preferred to style this blurring of combatants, non-combatants, conflict types, and the definitions of war and definitions of peacetime as more of a convergence into multimodal or hybrid wars. And that's where you start to get the modern iteration, the modern evolution of understanding of hybridized or hybrid warfare. His article's on the right. It's an interesting read still. Next slide, please. As I said, they were largely as well post-Cold War in the absence of, when on the threat horizon, you couldn't then envisage large-scale interstate war. There was something of a peace dividend. Instead, they were responses to counterinsurgency campaigns, including Afghanistan. I mean, the Soviet Union only pulled out in 1988 after, what, 9 years. And, you know, then the US and Western coalition forces have gone in and pulled out again with much the same experience. And I could talk to you quite separately about that as well, and soldiering experience in those conflicts. But of course, as well, there was turmoil in the Caucasus, in the Middle East, and then in international counterterrorism operations that resulted from and sprang out of the 2011 through sort of 2013 Arab Spring, the real height of it, which saw the rise of, amongst other things, Islamic State. For Russia, honed in these kind of operations, and their major learning lessons in terms of counterinsurgency was in the two Chechen conflicts beginning in 1999. But COIN have been features of conflicts throughout recorded history. What's different in the modern world is the cyber context. It is our hyperconnectivity, not only to one another, we're not just talking about social media and mobile phones or cell phones, but in terms of all the things I was writing about in my cyber warfare book, which is all of the things that we take for granted. Number one being electricity. You attack electricity or attack it can hit the grid. Everything goes with it. Water, sanitation, road and rail transport, airlines, airports, everything. It's a direct threat to life from that one key sector alone. But any one individual sector can be hit. Russia's tried them all. And I'll talk about this in a little while. Next slide, please. Cyber also provides reach, which is unprecedented in human history, where you've got a real small amount of people and non-uniform people as well. In the case of Russian political influence campaigns in and around 2016, culminating in two big things, which I've got two big case studies on, which is and these are just in sequence order, the 2016 Brexit referendum in the UK, which just tilted enough for Britain to leave the European Union and all has fallen since. And Russian influence on the 2016 US presidential election. Again, potentially enough just to shift that needle enough in key states. And they did micro-targeting with individuals. In any event, this was a relatively small number of people operating outside, an industrial type factory. Corrugated iron in St. Petersburg. We've got the pictures of it, run by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was not long assassinated. Whole other sort of conversation with him, but this was simply known as the Internet Research Agency. What they were was a troll farm, but they micro-targeted voters, and they did enough strategic messaging that, the results are playing out still. I can't prove, and we don't know to what extent Russian influence affected the outcome. And unfortunately, our intelligence agencies were not fleet-footed enough to realize this was happening, either at the time in terms of preventative measures, or two, in post facto doing an analysis of what effects it had and why. And these are still being debated. I'll be perfectly honest with you, it annoys me, the style and the types of debate we're having. It's almost as if it's still a question. It's not a question. It is something that requires systematic analysis, and that has only been really tackled now in the wake of 2016, but still not enough to my satisfaction. Anyway, that's a separate point. We've also, of course, got the internet in our pockets. We got irregular messaging, one-to-one and one-to-many messaging platforms as well. We see enormous amounts of information, a lot of which is not verifiable. That's where you're into the dis and misinformation space. And whether state on state or at this non or sub-state level, unconventional, regular and irregular threats are offering asymmetrical challenges. So this is not red on blue. It's asymmetrical challenges to Clausewitzian orthodoxy. This is Clausewitz's primary trinity on the right. There is allied to a secondary trinity. The primary trinity consists of the will for people to fight and believe. And that's rooted in issues of which Clausewitz understood from the battlefield of hate, of enmity, of primal violence, of passion, or reason as a counterpoint. You've also got ideas of chance and uncertainty, and that's part of the fog of war. And that could be affected by anything from the weather to bad luck to miscommunication to soldiers, officers disobeying orders, or carrying out, or diplomats creating acts upon their own right and doing track 2 or track 1.5 diplomacy. That's part of the trinity. It's often sort of And this is the secondary trinity, confused with the secondary, which is the people, the armed forces, and government or people. And then they're not blended together. Clausius is very clear to separate his primary and secondary trinity out. Moving on to the modern take, cyber has real advantages, but what it can't do is to take, and it can't hold territory by itself. It can destabilize, it can be debilitating, it can also be destructive, but it cannot take and hold territory. It can also degrade, damage, or weaken states over time. That could be as few as a matter of, could be minutes. I mean, we're talking about photonic speed of light instructions and coded communications. It is that, I mean, that quick. So unless you've got resilience and multiple layers of defense, and you've got backup, and I could talk to you about all the backup Ukraine had allied to the European Union. Without that, there is a big risk of a kill switch. But it's more likely to be over time, but it could be a matter of hours or days. But what we've seen in Ukraine is this has been over a period of years, and we'll talk about it a little. And that produces the danger of it starts to look like a million pinprick attacks. Doesn't add up to much, and it's just here and there. But what they're doing is probing and feeling and seeing and looking for weak points and gateways in. And that also produces the frog boiling in water analogy, which is a frog will jump out if you put it in boiling water. But if you just let it gradually, it'll boil to death over time. It just doesn't has the capacity to recognize what's happening. So within Clausius's trinity of violence, chance, and probability, with war seen as a political action, the most famous dictum from Clausius is war is a continuation of policy or politics by other means, lies the tendency to escalate and to rouse passions. And what that does, it leads to previous constraints being removed. Now, in the modern world, with cyber crossing all 4 other domains of warfare, this is clear dimensions for hybridized conflict. And speed is one of those. Next slide, please. And this is part of the boiling frog mentality as well, that for a decade, it's taken the West considerable time to have internal and some public discussions that we are in a proxy war with Russia. It's not publicly and politically palatable, whether in Western Europe or in the United States, but it's a big part of the reason why there's this huge debate and huge effort as well to send forces in, or whether not to send actual forces in terms of personnel, but in terms of equipment and supplies and budget and sanctions and everything else. That, for some, has been a hot piece rather than an outright war. And many argue that the Russian threat's not going to, I mean, it does vary depending on which member states you talk to. I mean, Finland feels it acutely, so does Poland, and yourselves most noticeably, obviously. It is felt, but what has been seen in other parts of the West is covert, indirect political operations. And that is largely been conducted sort of beneath in that sub-grey area threshold by Russian intelligence and security agencies. Now, they're potent and they strike from every side and every angle. Now, whether they're driven by a single intent, I'm not sure, but I mean, the modus vivendi is clear. It's to destabilize, it's to challenge the liberal order, it's to paint the Russian narrative and so on. What hybrid warfare does also is blur the distinction between competence and non-competence, as well as between non and sub-state actors. All of this is absolutely, if you look carefully, in evidence in so many instances. Next slide, please. So we could trace back election interference, political influence operations to around about 2004. There was obviously the change in presidency. You had Medvedev swap places with Putin in between 2000 and 2004. He comes back into office. Something changed. I couldn't tell you exactly what, why, or when. Something changed. And afterwards, it's seen upwards 47 nations become targets, and latest being Moldova, not just last week, but into this week. It has led to, I thoroughly despise the term, but fake news as a mantra, basically to back down, to stamp on any piece of investigative journalism that sheds bad light on any given actor. And it's just dismissed as fake news, rather than actually tackle the subject, investigate it, and to look at the evidence. Look at the evidence base. And with it has come deep-seated doubts in investigative and just frankly mainstream print journalism and mainstream television. And audiences are in decline, especially in print media, instead of which people look for the internet and social media for their sources of information. What they're not seeing is the seeding of mis and disinformation, not entirely, but a significant percentage and portion is emanating from Russia and from some other actors who are sympathetic, or nation states who are sympathetic. These are active measures campaigns that reaches back into the Soviet past. That playbook is being leveraged by domestic political parties as well as part of a wider trend, first pioneered by so-called spin doctors, people who are paid consultants, and they paint a particular picture of policies and of candidates. Government advisors or special advisors do similar things. All of it in the West is geared around the election cycles, which are regular and periodic. And of course, it's not just the big elections, it's in statewide elections and regional elections and European level elections. And it's always happening. It's almost a constant process. I mean, this year has been deemed the year of elections. I think it's a third of the planet has gone to the polls this year, maybe a half. I can't remember the exact number. The latest outside of Moldova is Japan, and that's a changed election again. But of course, we've got the US presidential elections in a little over a week. Russia's been really adept at this. It's mined the open societies of the West, and it's cultivated agents of influence. That's included foundations and Russian money, think tanks, companies, organizations, and individuals who share a similar or related national or worldview. Most people don't see it as the Soviet Union 2.0. It lacks an ideological foundation, but what it does have is a clear it's a right-leaning, and they're more clear what they're against than what they're for. But it's a very loose coalition. Next, I will just point out where this stretches back to antiquity. If you look at Sun Tzu's quote above from the Art of War, this is 3.5 millennia old. This has been understood strategically, or maybe we've just forgotten the lessons. Sun Tzu said, if sovereign and subject are in accord, put division between them. Attack where they are unprepared, appear where you were not expected. And that is the sort of thing that leads to January the 6th in the United States. And with that is Western support and the dangers presented to NATO by a future administration should Donald Trump be elected. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to focus in again on the potential for cyber war, what was and might have been. Now, prior to the invasion, the cyber side of Russian operations really saw an uptick from spring 2021 through to spring 2022. That included the owner-operators of critical infrastructure, most of which are private sector. Among the targets were municipal water supplies, as well as major oil and gas companies. In the weeks prior to February and the invasion, they also targeted underground gas storage facilities, electricity operators, which is the biggie, as well as healthcare providers. They also targeted agriculture and agribusinesses, as well as some of Ukraine's key internet service providers. So they're trying, it's clear, in my eyes, what they were trying to do. Where this, I think, gets conceptually confusing for people is that I say we, I'm not one of them, but in the discipline and in policy-making, decision-making circles, we lump in everything together. Information warfare, the espionage side, the cyber espionage. We need to have better terminology, and we need to have a real strong definitional sense of the boundaries. Because what we're talking about here is it's leading into the cyberkinetic, that it makes things go bang and boom and machinery to grind and things not to work or to misbehave. That includes, for example, you imagine you're driving around and the entire traffic system fails. I mean, just the traffic lights alone fail. You're going to have crashes, you're going to have gridlock very, 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 very quickly. Just that one alone. And I can show you case studies and I can show you evidence where that is being tested. But energy infrastructure is the biggest case in point where cyber espionage can pivot into destructive warfare, and that produces a direct threat to life and well-being. Particularly, it's not easy. It's for a whole multiplicity of reasons. It's not easy. But taking out electricity regionally, which I would go on to say has been attempted, but particularly at scale, would, and potentially blinded Ukraine, sent citizens into panic and potentially helped topple the leadership or helped Russia try and decapitate the leadership. Next slide, please. They knew what they were doing. They've been trying and attempting various forms of cyber warfare, cyber espionage, pivoting to cyber warfare throughout the 2010s. This has been described as a steady drumbeat of attacks, which targeted Ukraine's government, your military, telecommunications infrastructure, and ICT. Russia has really been a determined and is a cost-effective set of capabilities for them as well. And it's also low visibility. And that's where it's helpful and useful for intelligence gathering and for preparation of the battlefield. That applies most notably, most obviously in Ukraine, but also in other parts of its near abroad, as well as in Western nations. And we've seen really targeted cyber attacks in Ukraine since particularly 2014 onwards. Next slide, please. Russia's two main threat actors, they are known in the cybersecurity community as advanced persistent threats. The two groups are run by the Russian military intelligence, the GRU. This is Fancy Bear APT-28 and Cozy Bear APT-29, run by the SVR. It's not even easy to directly, it wasn't at least, to directly attribute it to both of them, both of the state intelligence agencies, but increasingly the cybersecurity industry and big government organizations, including the FBI and Europol, and coordinated across governments, have attributed and have pointed the finger. In 2015 and again in 2016, APT-28 conducted two specific cyber espionage campaigns. The first was Black Energy, the second was Industrial Crash Override. Now, this took out parts of Ukraine's regional electrical grid system, but only part of it. It was the it was the Dutch and British governments who attributed the black energy tax to Russia's GRU. They called it out publicly, which was rare at the time. And particularly a team dubbed Sandworm. And this is where you're into the taxonomy of the threat actors. And I don't like it. Again, it's another thing I don't like. It just confuses and clouds people's thinking on this. I understand from a cyber forensic point of view why, but I just don't think it's helpful for messaging, for understanding. But Sandworm is linked to the GRU's military unit 74455. It's also, and this is more rare than it is common, it's also coordinated with APT-28. What tends to happen is Russia, like throughout this intelligence system, it runs competing operations. It wants to see survival of the fittest test. Most intelligence agencies, they deconflict. They don't go after the same targets. Russia's do, and sometimes they're into server spaces and they're into systems, and there's two threat actors in there, and it's often these two, but not necessarily they'll know about one another's campaigns. And this is partly because there's a lot of latency and a lot of undiscovery, but it's partly also what leads to their exposure. Next slide, please. Through black energy, Ukraine was the first nation to experience a cyber attack which turned part of its power grid. And this is where, and this is a key aspect of my 2022 book, this is where, and I will add, my book and the legal definitions are just not plucked out of the air. They're based on discussions and NATO's two Tallinn manuals. So I went to Tallinn and to NATO's SciCon conferences for about 3 years. The proceedings are sitting next to me. I'm in one of them. And the international team of legal scholars, this is what they're talking about, is it's got to cross the threshold into violence or armed attack. So it's got to be destructive, essentially. And that's what black energy could do. It could, because it is a takedown of systems, it directly produces a threat to life. For example, they were careful in what they didn't do. Hospitals were one of the sectors that healthcare wasn't hit. Now, immediately that produces a threat to life. If you target water as a side order, that too can produce a direct threat to life. And if you cut heating during the middle of winter and freezing winter, and for the elderly particularly and vulnerable, that too produces a direct threat to life. That's where the qualifications lie. So we do think carefully about this. I think carefully about this. Black energy evolved into a campaign spanning almost a decade. The third iteration, precision targeted 3 regional power distribution companies. That led to power cuts in Christmas 2015, and then particularly cold winter in 2015. That was only the 4th ever known case of malicious code purpose-built to disrupt physical systems. 2 of them had been in laboratories. One was the Aurora test. The second was Stuxnet. The third was a German steel mill. This was the 4th, but real world. Stuxnet was real world as well, but it was a very precision targeted attack. A year later, this campaign, particular malware groups termed Indestroyer or Crash Override, both the same thing. That was a major evolution of those general purpose tools used in 2015. The cyber forensics that we conducted saw the same technical hallmarks. They saw the same indicators of compromise as well. And what it was, even more so, was a demonstration of capability, because the forensics that were done showed that Russia could have gone further. It could really have gone into something called the OT, the operational technology layer. And that's where you've got, you can hit power grids and you can do mass outage. But what it wasn't designed to do that. It did not want to go over and cross that threshold or show capability at that point. So all they wanted to do it's a proof of concept. in the real world. And one thing to bear in mind as well, they understood the grid system because of the old Soviet system. They, in turn, also had the same or similar systems right throughout their critical infrastructure. That makes them vulnerable in return to exactly what they're trying to do to you. But that attack too was attributed to Sandworm. Next slide, please. Only lasted a few days. It didn't stand still though. Industry 2.0 has been used or attempted to be used in the Ukraine war. It was also detected at Boryspil Airport, as well as a mining company and railway company in 2016. Flag drops another that's been used. Bad Rabbit ransomware that hits the metro system in Odessa Airport. Wiperware has been found as well that will wipe hard drives. It's non-recoverable. It looks like ransomware, but it's not. So it tries to pretend that it's cyber criminal groups. The most notable example, most famous and well understood by NATO and by others, is NotPetya back in 2017. In 2018, a water treatment station in Petrovsk was also hit by a malware, the VPN filter. X-Agent is another piece of really modular malware that was used to disrupt Ukrainian artillery as well. Next slide, please. Immediately prior to the invasion, oil and port storage facilities across Europe were hit. It was thought to be cybercriminal gangs, two of them, Black Cat and Conti. But of course, Russia's been adept at using proxies and privateers, so we still don't know for absolute certainty. More than that, we know that Russia protects a cybercriminal fraternity. They also experience kickbacks. There is a modus vivendi between the Russian state and cybercriminal groups. I'm talking for about an hour now, but I can talk about any of these aspects going forward. What Russia did was both attempt cyber espionage and cyber warfare against Ukraine immediately prior to the invasion and during the early stages when it was hoping a blitzkrieg and run through. The first sort of series of attacks, the most notable one was on Viasat, which is a provider of satellite communications both for commercial and military users. More critically, they were looking to hit electrical substations in Ukraine, and that saw developmental use of industrial crash override. They also went after your railway network, Ukraine's railway network. Next slide, please. They were lucky on the side of, well, not lucky. The railways were so vitally important, both for people fleeing and for supplies and food inwardly. You can see why, from a strategic military point of view, why they were attacking them. But it's also breaching the law of armed conflict because you're hitting civilians. On the defensive side, critical support was provided both by Western governments as well as by private industry. In addition to which, crucial intelligence was also shared with Ukraine. A number of these firms have gone public. Microsoft is one of the real big flag wavers. Tom Burt, one of their corporate vice presidents, publicly disclosed, and they've done regular reporting on this, that they've been working around the clock to assist Ukraine. That included helping government agencies against Russia's nation-state actors. These are the two big APTs I was talking about earlier, Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear. They helped enormously with protecting Ukraine's critical infrastructure. That included moving portions of Ukraine's Western ICT services over to the European cloud so they could ensure that in the event of the worst, that critical services could still function. And there's almost like a mirror backup as well. Because what Russia had also been doing, when they were failing with their cyber attacks, they were hitting these sites kinetically with missiles. So it was clear to the, and this really took enormous time to find out what was happening. I mean, this is largely hidden, but and like I said, this is in the the article I did, but it's also in a number of the books as well. So they were combining cyber and kinetic on the same geographic locations and hitting the same sites. 55% of these were Ukrainian government facilities, concentrated upon energy, transportation, water, law enforcement services, emergency services, and healthcare. That's your critical backbone. Don't need necessarily to go directly after military or military on military, because you're hitting the underbelly, the underpinnings. And that is a disabler of the military. They also attacked Ukrainian industrial control systems. That's what ICS means. Industrial control systems are the critical operational arm, because they control industrial processes. And that's where cyber espionage pivots into destructive cyber warfare. Next slide, please. This is what they were hitting. So it's clear. And this is Microsoft's been really stand up in not only saying exactly what they've been finding and what the forensics have told them. You imagine the resources they've got. But a number of other companies have as well. And I've got to say, they've been stand-up people to do this. Next slide, please, because of course they also become targets. As winter 2022 turned into summer 2023, we see Russia switch its seasonal focus. Where? Your agricultural sector. Agribusinesses were penetrated with malware. They looked to steal data both for intelligence purposes and propaganda. They also conducted, when they failed, or even if they didn't fail, they'd still do it, kinetic missile strikes against these targets. They did so in a period where the grain deal was under, well, Russia pulled out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which could have fed 1 million people and is a big export driver and, you know, a source of foreign currency. Again, another breach of the law of armed conflict. As summer 2023 turned again to winter, Russia once more turned its seasonal focus onto Ukraine's energy infrastructure. It's looking to make life uncomfortable for people and to show its reach. They've been called out, they've been charged, including by the International Criminal Court, including very many individuals. In turn, Russian intelligence has attacked them, as well as NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and those concerned with human rights, and just said, no, it's just not true. We're not doing any of this. You're making it up. Next slide, please. Amazon, Microsoft, and a number have come forward, including Mandiant, who said the level of collective defense between governments, companies, and security stakeholders across the world was and has been and is continuing to be unprecedented in scope. They're allied as well to Western governments and their intelligence agencies. I'll tell you a lot more about this, to a degree at least, and how they're allied and are allying to Ukrainian state services, including the SCIP, your cybersecurity prime organization, Ukrainian intelligence, so one arm of it, the SBU, as well as the civilian army, the so-called IT army of patriotic hackers. However, Ukraine also got very lucky a number of times, at least twice. One during the early stages, and this is coming from senior officials at Ukraine's SSSSCIP. The other was when Russia targeted the railway network at a key stage in spring of 2022. I think that the discovery happened, but they were already in the systems at the time. And this was wiperware. We were lucky in the sense of it was discovered before it was activated. I've talked about this already, that it was a vital supply line inward for weapons and humanitarian aid, as well as a lifeline for refugees fleeing the fighting. Next slide, please. I've talked about APTs. I will come to us again, I promise soon. What I haven't talked about is APMs, advanced persistent manipulators, and that is the other counterpoise, that is the other side that's rocking the cradle. And this is where Russian intelligence agencies, the ones I've mentioned, are seeding dis and misinformation, sowing doubt, creating propaganda, political military influence operations to try and control the information space. This is why you're into the debate of information warfare, and to control political social narratives. They're really cost effective, and they're also stealthy, deniable, and the tactical employment of dismiss and malinformation have been really used pervasively and extensively by the Kremlin. Not only in Ukraine, and not only in the West, but also for managing political consent and for handling opposition groups domestically. They were part of what have been termed, this is a term that originated around about 2015 in NATO circles, part of the 4Ds of Russian information warfare: to dismiss, to distort, to distract, and to dismay. Next slide, please. It dismisses critics, distorts facts, distracts from issues, and dismays the audience. But I think we need to think about more, because at the very least, we need to talk about a fifth, and that's disruption. It's been enormously disruptive. This is not just at the level of information warfare, but also alongside that sixthly of destruction, really indeed setting in the context of hybrid warfare in Ukraine and hybridized warfare more widely. The scale of Russian disinformation operations, their campaigns, is such that the European Union founded the EU versus Disinfo project in 2015. You can sign up to this if you haven't. I recommend you do. If you don't, it is a wonderful resource, and it's really important the European Union is doing this. Its aim is to better forecast, address, and respond to the Russian Federation's ongoing disinformation campaigns. Its database, this is not particularly new either, contains over 12,000 samples. 40% of those samples relate to Ukraine. They center it around so-called 12 myths, which two of their members describe as a fire hose of falsehoods turned out by Russia's propaganda machine. That includes, as you can see on the right there, portraying Ukraine as an enemy, to divide and destabilize, to Ukraine's internal audience, the international audience then, to legitimize Russian aggression. Next slide, please. This is Russian intelligence. They are really, really, really active and aggressive. The more internally, but the FSB is at least as aggressive as the SVR and GRU, but they're more geared, SVR and GRU, more geared to external attacks. But it's also part of the domestic power play and interplay. Mark Galeotti, who I think is one of the UK's two leading Russia experts, certainly outside of government, alongside Kia Giles. But Galeotti asserted the security community in Russia is characterized by division, duplication, and deep institutional rivalry. And that's where you've had competing campaigns. What is consistent, however, is that the Kremlin and President Putin and the Security Council, that small team of people, deny everything through Maskirovka. even when the strongest evidence of Russian state involvement is presented. I'll give you lots and lots of examples, including the Skripal poisoning in Salisbury. Next slide, please. And I'm getting towards the end. I mentioned earlier the Gerasimov doctrine. That's General Gerasimov. Not a theoretician, not particularly a cyber person or keeper. But cyber is an arena generally, and this is well understood by Russian intelligence, where inconvenience and discomfort can be created for governments, for societies, and for economies, but without escalation into acts that would qualify as the use of force or armed conflict. This is certainly true prior to 2022, well, to a degree at least. But they were kind of boundary pushing, but more careful than they've been since. But what the Gerasimov doctrine essentially adds up to, and it is public, it is about, and this allies to what I was talking about with China, non-military means of achieving political and strategic goals, which has grown and in many cases exceeded the power of force or weapons and their effectiveness. Part of which is information warfare, part of which is cyber espionage. The Galeotti, it doesn't exist. He came up with a term, he talked about it. Instead, it's been lumbering clumsily into the world to spread fear and loathing in its wake. But for Galeotti, there is no single doctrine. Next slide, please. These are some of the cohort of people who've been instrumental in developing this espionage and warfare suite of activities. Sorry for coughing. This is a product for speaking constantly for an hour. Anatoly Sedyakov, Nikolai Makarov, Kobarov, Shoigu, defense minister, Peter Ivashutin, all of which career intelligence people, career military, they are part of that mix of creating the so-called Gerasimov doctrine and basically the operation of it. Next slide, please. They're more looking at regime change at that time, at least in the information space, drawing on color revolutions, Arab Spring, Euromaidan, Revolution of Dignity, all of which they saw as being orchestrated by the CIA and Western intelligence. And this is where I'm talking about mirror image, where we've got to be careful. Different terminologies, different conceptions. Russia's understanding, like the Chinese, is different. And the West, I think, has been caught somewhat fleet-footed, leaden-footed, not fleet-footed, quite the opposite. What's also not helped as well is broader changes. The Arab Spring and then preceding that 9/11 have seen an enormous focus placed on counterterrorism by Western intelligence. Previously, he had dedicated criminologists and sinologists and regional expertise in area that's there to express being watered down because counterterrorism has really risen up the agenda. And that's with this sort of layered understanding has been, but basically Russia's exploited that. And this slide is where I talk about it. But I've provided the slides to you all. You're very welcome to see them, share them, and discuss them. Next slide, please. It's only one of the elements, though. Go, next one. Thank you. Information warfare is only one of the elements. but it does tie into its foreign security policy. It also plays a really important part suppressing domestic opposition. It's seen Russia conduct operations against the Baltic states, Georgia, and of course, Ukraine, and in the lead up to Crimea in 2014. They've also influenced a whole multitude of elections, including the two I mentioned earlier, but the French elections in 2017 and the runoff between Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen, Carles Puigdemont attempted referendum in Catalonia in 2017, all the way through to Moldova recently. Serbia has been another one, Venezuela has been another, 47, upwards of 47. All of them are designed, I say all, the sub-Saharan African ones maybe to a different degree or with a different focus. But the subtext is that with weakening the European Union, it's likely to benefit Russia, as well as diluting NATO's cohesion and effectiveness. They see it as a zero-sum game. Next slide, please. And these are some of their activities. Sort of conscious of time, so I'm not going to go through them. But again, I provided all of these to you, and I never intended to talk about all of this in detail. It's more the micro level of analysis. But I'm naming names and talking about people and detailing events and talking about their departments and their divisions and how the intelligence agencies are made up and comprised. Next slide, please. And this is part of where they're borrowing from. This is unrestricted warfare. This is Quine Wang. It's really, as a strategic theorist, it's a remarkable book. I mean, it's 25 years old now, years ahead of its time, years. They would clearly have read Clausewitz. It reads like a rereading of Clausewitz for the information age. And one of the things they were talking about is that if we acknowledge that the key principles of war no longer of using armed force to compel the enemy to submit to one's will, and instead conceive of it of using all means, including armed force, but also non-armed force, military and non-military, as well as lethal and non-lethal means to compel the enemy to accept one's interests. That is what they're terming unrestricted warfare. It's everything. Hoffman's work, I was talking about it, that was a decade later. This was innovative. Next slide, please. It meant combining Norman Schwarzkopf, Gulf War commander, with George Soros, made his name in the back end of the 2008 financial crash and earlier, as well as Osama bin Laden type terrorist tactics. It's everything. But pick and choose. One of them also believes that war with the US was inevitable as China rose to meet direct competition. That's part of a wider sort of conversation. In addition to which, they're talking about stock market crashes, malware, viruses, rumors or scandals as weapons, hacking, trade wars, financial wars, ecology, psychology, smuggling, media, drugs, networks, technological war, and going back to what we're talking about with fake news, fabricated resources, culture, and international law warfare. There's little doubt in my mind, both in terms of the core arguments and how it's been operationalized, not just by China, but especially by Russia. It works. It works. It wasn't conceived of this way at the time, but it works. Next slide, please. They were talking about, this is later theorists now. Shen Waiganin is one of them. He's talking about social psychological war. And that's addressing the communication channels between class and social groups. And you think how the internet and social media has changed the hierarchy and structure, and it's sort of collapsed the barriers to, to enable one-to-one and one-to-many communications between, I'm speaking directly with politicians or with celebrities, and the globalization of media sources. That started to break the monopoly that a regime exercised over the information space of the past. That set the stage for propaganda war, the battle for public opinion, and social psychological war, SPW. And that was seen as also that culture is a glue for society and a foundation for social stability, for social norms, and for shaping the social system. And Shen said cultural confusion will ultimately affect the security of a nation's social strata. And again, it's also grounded in the real world. They're seeing regime change in the Arab Spring. Also, they saw elements of it in a very brief sort of pro-democracy revolution, the Jasmine Revolution. They've seen it also in Hong Kong, and to a lesser extent, other parts of the Chinese state as well. Next slide. This is where it gets interesting in the sense of Russia's operationalizing and the sort of dialogues they've had. They've had multiple meetings about this. Oh, well, I say about this. They've at high level, both intelligent, political, military conversations. They're held as part of, you will know some of these, the G20, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as part of the UN, both the Security Council members. BRICS met again last week. The Waldai Group is something you probably may not have heard of. Used to meet in Germany in Gelsenkirchen. They've had lots and lots of these dialogues. And they've been talking about it since about 2009. You also see a lot of what I've just talked about in certain terms of unrestricted and social psychological warfare in the Gerasimov doctrine. I can't prove any of this. I will admit happily I can't, but it's an interesting conversation to have. I don't know whether any of you have, but I've not seen this discussed publicly. Next slide, please, and it should be very much towards the end now. Yeah. All I can think of, and I can't rationalize, and I'm not sure I can, that the Kremlin and maybe one person saw an opportunity to step out of that grey zone they've been in and around since 2014. For some, already into the red zone, but really into that red zone of war in February 2022. Warnings might change with events. I do worry about another long, these are international relations terms, the long peace or 20 years crisis. This is the gap between World War I and II, that you're basically storing up problems rather than solving. Or NATO and the European Union are clearly being tested, as is absolutely Ukraine. Russia's strategy as well needs to be set in the context of their long-standing nature of their foreign policy and the objective to weaken adversaries, especially nations on its periphery, those in NATO, as well as the United States, by any means available. And across the West and Indo-Africa, Sahel, they've been targeting nations unfriendly to the Kremlin, or where Russia is once more attempting to grow its influence. But Ukraine has really, really been the epicenter. Next slide is, I think, me done. Yes. Thank you very much for listening for the last hour and a quarter. It's over to one of you now to so I'm really happy to answer any questions as best I can.
Well, thank you very much for this lecture, and that was great pleasure to hear you, Professor Stoddard. Thank you so much for sharing your findings and your research. I hope that your research will have great success. And yeah, it's very sad that Ukraine now is a lab for cyber attacks for Russia, and that's a big field for research, for further research. And now we continue with our discussion section. So I see many questions. I hope, okay. Thank you. Well, Christina, you're welcome. Дрозденко Christina.
Thank you very much for such an interesting lecture, and thank you for the opportunity to ask some questions. My name is Christina. I'm a second year international relations student. And from your point of view, what role did information warfare and disinformation play in Russia's preparation for both the 2014 and 2022 campaigns?
Good question. I think you'd look at it in two dimensions. One is, and kind of for this, we've got to look at Afghanistan in terms of the domestic side and controlling the information space, because it's been portrayed as this special military operation. They've slipped up a couple of times and called it war. They've called it for what it is, but they're trying to placate particularly the Western oblast areas. They're not sending those into fight. It's very much about controlling that information space. In the same time, they've, well, in fact, they stamped on any significant opposition at home. They've created the domestic conditions to enable them to basically do anything they would have done in the Tsarist times and just have, and Keir Giles says this in his 3 books, that it's the makeup of the Russian state itself since the brief flirtation with democracy and capitalism in the 1990s. It's also, of course, and this was key in bothered the hell out of me, I'll be honest with you, because I spoke up about this in 2014, of how does the West and NATO and the European Union respond to the annexation of Crimea. They did it at the back end of the Winter Olympics in Sochi. They sort of used that as a sort of a staging ground because they had security operations there, and it was easy for them to strip off the insignia and then do it. But there was no pushback from, and the information narrative was allowed to seed that it was a stability operation because it was an interregnum between Poroshenko fleeing and the next president coming in, and they used that as an opportunity. They seized the information high ground to an external audience, whilst there was a change in not just leadership but direction, and with it there was just and then a quick referendum, which is why you're into lawfare. So they're seizing that information space and trying to legitimize. But where was the European Union and where was NATO? I asked this at the time and I was not given good answers. But it did lead later to the EU versus Disinfo project for one. But, you've got an increasing number of people with eyes on this. Myself is just one of a number. But I think the information war side, it's been one of the keys to lay the groundwork for military intervention. And it's been escalating over time. And it's just not, of course, it's not only military, it's in other spaces, including cyber espionage and active measures and quite a lot of destabilization attempts as well, besides. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
A good question.
Well, thank you. Maria, you're welcome.
Good day. Thank you so much for such a mindful lecture. I'm studying, already studying international relation for 2 years. And my question, what lessons can Ukraine and its allies learn from this hybrid conflict to prevent the future hybrid wars? And the second question, how do you think that Russia's hybrid war campaign will develop in the future? And what challenges can it pose for Ukraine and our allies in the future?
Okay. I'm going to try and remember those three questions.
The
They're good
first
questions. No, that's all right. I remember them. They're all good questions. Well, I think two things initially. I mean, you could talk about multiple dimensions to this, because there's an economic and energy dimension as well, with energy security and the use of Russia's hydrocarbon base with Gazprom and so on. You know, money's been and corruption has been a big issue in the West. Because we could talk about the London laundromat or London by the, was it Moscow on Thames? You know, there's been an awful lot of Russian money floating in and around Europe, and they pump money into key individuals and political parties. That would be one dimension I talk about, but it's also about critical thinking skills. Is for disinformation to succeed, needs a receptive audience. And that audience does not have sufficient media literacy. It believes in what it sees and what is being said. And it lacks a sort of, you know, to go to a reliable evidentiary base to counteract or to challenge what it's being told, whether it's been about migration, about government corruption, about liberalism, about this, and Russia, of course, paints itself, or the Russian government, as a pillar of how to manage societies, about how to, you know, maintain a strong sense of nationalism. And it's very clear on what they don't want and don't like. It's less clear on what sort of progressive policies are. That's one element. The other is, probably the last one, and there's a whole range of things I could talk about, but on the military side is, I think probably for too long the West has coattailed on the Americans, on American capability. It needs to do more for its own defense. It's not a new argument. Half my career was in the nuclear weapons field, and it's in all of my earlier books, is something called burden sharing. That's been a feature from at least, well, it's been a feature across the Cold War, but certainly from the 60s onwards, when European economies were recovering from the war, that they weren't doing enough for their own efforts. And just post-Cold War, it's just defense spending has dropped and dropped and dropped, and capabilities have dropped with it. But more than that, it's resources, it's manpower, it's people power. It's led to some hollowed out forces. So on that side, that's one area we can do more. Because if, God forbid, I do mean God forbid, if we go into a hot war scenario, fully fledged, I mean, it's just, yeah, it's a hard one to conceive of because of the implications. Then that effort is going to have to be really ramped up. And we've also got an election in the US, and we don't know the outcome. And we don't know what the future of NATO or NATO Europe might be. I think they're really, really important lessons, conversations to have, concerns I have, not just me, others. And what can we do best? One, that this, hopefully there is peaceable outcome. And I think for a number of reasons, this is where I'm into the 20 years crisis, that it can't be about ceding territory. If it is, it's storing problems. And we've seen enough of that. But that may need regime change in Russia. But if you talk to informed commentators, that may not produce the outcome that's hoped for because of the state structure and the regime type. We'll see. I hope for the best. So what does it sort of land in a note of positivity for you? Because it was such good questions.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We have two more questions, I see. Yes, Alexander, you're welcome as well. Please.
Good afternoon. My name is Alexander. I'm the student of second year International Relations Studies. First of all, thank you for your lecture. And my question is, like you mentioned, that Ukraine is a kind of some specific platform for testing Russia's limits. and responding to its action in general. But Ukraine is not the only country that has been subjected by Russia to its experiment. So I'm speaking of Moldova and Transnistria and Georgia with Abkhazia and Ossetia. In the past, when do you think, my question is, when do you think the world will be able to give a clear response to Russia's actions and stop this hybrid expansion?
Yeah, well, I agree with you. And I was going to say Nagorno-Karabakh is another one, the enclave in Moldova in the east. And I mean, all of these have been exploited and exploitable. I think I'm not sure there's an answer per se, but it's probably an evolutionary process. I mean, if we're looking at Moldova as an example, you can look at Georgia, you can look at others too, and maybe look at the pathways that the Baltic states have gone on, or the journey they've gone on, where they fully embraced Western values. And it's not just the value system, it's to root at corruption, to, if you want to be if a population wants to be part of a project, they should have a right as people to be part of that. But you're right, and what we've seen again is money, disinformation campaigns, various dirty tricks, and all of which is denied. So probably that is a much domestic political issue, because of course you've got a party in power who've been, I think, their third term now. That is a conversation for the people in the political system. But at the same time, the European Union will continue, I'm sure, to do what it's doing in supporting its democratic journey or process. But again, this is a conversation for, it's got to be bottom up, a bottom up process. I don't think it can be dictated to by anyone, even the big IGO, the big ones like the European Union or by NATO. What more can we do is eyes open, chest out, be clear-eyed, and not to take steps back. I think Russia's been not just rolling the dice, which it has been. It's been opportunistic, that's well known. But it's when it's not facing pushback, it's been given saccharine encouragement. And the part of the big playbook, and I come from the nuclear weapons field, is that nuclear saber rattling and the implications of full Western involvement. To what extent it is purely saber rattling, to what extent we've got to be careful of destabilization and of off-ramps and of command and control and decision making. That requires careful thought and diplomacy and future gazing. I mean, it's also in terms of, what happens within Russia itself. Will reform happen? Will change happen? Or wait for more of the same? Nobody lives forever, not even Putin. What the future holds is partly systemic. It's partly of the political system itself and the political class. It's also part of, and we've seen this in 1917, we've seen it in China in 1949. It's also a revolution from below. Maybe people just want better, want different. I hope for the best. I wish I had a really, really proper good answer for you.
Okay, thank you for your answer. I think that's it.
Thank you too. And yeah, Igor, you're welcome with your question, please.
First of all, thank you for a lecture. You helped me to remember what happened in 2010s and the beginning of 2000s. First of all, I have some add-in and later question. About add-in, Excuse me, but I should correct you about Chechen War. The Chechen War began in 1991 when Chechens organized a referendum about the independent Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. And the first president of this republic was Johar Dudayev. And President Yeltsin organized the anti-terroristic operation against the Chechens in the end of 1991 as the first Chechen company. This war Chechens won. In general, Chechens won the war because Russian government are paying until modern days it takes to Ramzan Akhmatovich Kadyrov. I mean to Chechen Republic, yeah. The first moment. The second moment, in 2010s, we have some positive moments. I mean, we were damaging Russia in peacetime during the candidacy of Petro Poroshenko and Donald J. Trump. Donald J. Trump was first who gave us the first javelins. He continued pressing Russia in economical sections. He заспокоїв як англійською мовою. Calm down Russian naval forces in Pacific Ocean in 2018, thanks to Donald J. Trump's administration. And the second moment. And the third moment, the greatest example of information warfare was and is propaganda campaign against Ukrainian former President Petro Poroshenko. For example, that he still has Lipetsk factory in Russia, but it is fake because this factory is owned by Russians. This is the first moment. This company was provided inside Ukraine, and Russia wanted to discredit Ukraine in European countries by Russia today. So, and this third moment. And the question is, what will happen in 2025? Because I think majority of European country will be ruled by radical rights. For example, in Netherlands, the majority of mandates in this parliament are owned by radical rights. I don't know what will be in 2025 in the United States of America, in other European countries. What will happen?
Well, you asked me to predict the future. I can't do that. I wish I could. Your analysis might be right. It's, you know, it's informed analysis, and you're entitled to your opinion. It was also said about the recent French elections where Marine Le Pen's National Front, not National Front anymore, National Union, whatever they called, got to the last round. And it was a clear choice. I remember talking to people, and it was, well, they're going to be in government. And it went to the electorate. And it was a really strong grassroots founded rejection of right-leaning values and a more centrist, long-term goalless vision of the state. But I mean, you can micro-fracture this right. I think Russian information warfare has been keeping those fires lit and throwing petrol on them now and again, and absolutely. And I think it's all added up. To what extent? And this is where you're into cognitive and behavioral psychology, you know, that this messaging, one, affects individuals and it affects their thinking process, and two, is what sort of mass effect does it have? You know, we're not in a position where we can fully articulate studies on this. I mean, you'd need machine learning, you'd probably need artificial intelligence, and you'd need access to data. But even if you did, trying to understand why there's sort of a rejection of liberalism and there's a palpable shift or drift to the right, that's a wider, deeper set of questions. I can honestly, if I had a day with you or a week, I'm not sure, I probably couldn't answer. It's a conversation, but I don't think there's an answer buried within them. It's you know, because you can make and people have, and I've heard this recently again from people I know, is comparisons with the 1930s, and I don't just mean the prelude of World War II, but the rise of Hitler and just the right more generally. And I've been sort of talking through these comparisons for a decade. The underlying reasons, and some of them are economic, some of these are, you know, fall off in, and why I was mentioning the media is there are journalistic ethics or the journalistic standards they're held to account. Social media is not, it's unregulated, and there's a whole package of issues buried within that, and it's entangling people. What you asked is provocative, but it's also, one, unanswerable from my point of view at this place in time, and two, part of a much wider, deeper conversation we can have for a week or two at some point. Good questions, really good, really pertinent, really sharp, like all of them. Fantastic.
Thank you for your answer.
Well, thank you too for discussion. And we have, I think, the last question from our students. Maxim, you're welcome. Please, what's your question?
Thank you so much. Greetings, Professor. I'm also a second-year student. I study international relations, and we all know that Putin's regime will not last forever. So my question is there any possibility that after Putin's regime will fall, Russia will finally take a path to democracy? And how do you can see or predict its path to democracy itself?
I wish, and I wish for better. I mean, you know, for all that, just on economics alone, the Russian state was, well, the Russian leadership has raped the state of its resources in terms of gas and oil, its hydrocarbon base, its natural resources. None of that money's been plowed back into Russian society. You don't, outside of places like St. Petersburg, Moscow, Sochi as well, you know, across. And who's been sent to fight in Ukraine? It's been in remote areas, minority populations. I mean, there are two. There are greater experts on this question than me. My wishful thinking side, my idealistic side, would say yes, all the above. And that people wake up one day and the sun is shining and they shake themselves out of this dystopian wilderness. But if you read someone who's more familiar with this, and that's here Giles, his latest book has just come out. I read the introduction to it, and he said, I hope we don't find it a depressing read. And I said, it is a depressing read, but it's also probably grounded in reality. And that, I'm afraid, is, under the current system, partly because it's done such a good job at suppressing opposition for so long, that you're likely to get not necessarily a Putin clone, but someone from that world. And it's going to be another sort of brutal round of competition between them as to who succeeds and what the power plays are. And rather than saying and thinking, well, what's best for Russian society and for the Russian people, it's going to be what's best for us. And it's going to be about regime survival and probably for personal survival in some cases. I can imagine scores being settled and vendettas and there'll be a power play. With that comes instability. I don't think there's, unless you know, any of you on the call know better than I don't think there's a natural successor. I don't see one. In terms of the opposition, like I said, most those who are dead are now abroad. Is there any hope for them coming back from exile? You've got lots of people, lots of Russians who care deeply about the future, and what better and what change. To what extent that's possible, I honestly don't know. But I would suggest, I don't think it's going to give you any comfort, I've got to be perfectly honest, but to read my compatriot, Hugh Giles's book. He's got 2 books specifically on this topic. I don't think they're going to help you sleep better at night, but if I was at home now, I'd have them on the shelf next to me, I'd tell you what they are. But he works at Chatham House. So it's Keir Giles, Chatham House, and you'll see his books listed. And he's also written a bunch of articles as well, which I'm sure you can access. And yeah, I'm afraid they're not going to bring you comfort or help you sleep, but he spent time there and he knows what he's talking about. And I hate to say he's probably right. But then I'll hope for better things. I do hope for better things. Thank you for your question. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you for your answer.
Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you for answers, and think that that's enough with our students' questions. And now, well, I see our colleague Irina would like to say several words. Ira, you're welcome.
Yes, also greetings, and thank you very much, Professor Stoddart, for such interesting lecture, very informative and also topical for Ukrainian students, scientific, and not only Ukrainian one. And also I have such a question, as your opinion, we understand that Ukraine, Russia are not alone in the world, in our world order, and we have such alliances as such intelligence, yes, alliances as the Five Eye, Nine Eye, and so on. Great Britain also participated in it. And how do you think, was it possible to protect Ukraine from this, from their sides, yes, to prevent such aggressive action of Russia in cyber, yes, space, or was it maybe in their profit, or also all war as a profit for someone? How can you estimate the relevance of such alliances, or our community, international community, should create new one alliances which will provide security only in cyberspace? Thank you very much.
I've thought about those questions. What? On the one hand, both would, I mean, China's, just to change the angle of attack a little bit, China's gone after, it's used cyber espionage almost purely for intellectual property theft, but it's gone right through the defense industrial base. Russia's done a bit of the same. Russia's used the information space far more active. Not that China hasn't, and it's not to say that Western powers haven't done the same. It's just we don't read, or at least that's not our perspective. We're looking at it from a defensive point of view, and on that defensive point of view, I'd absolutely say that, and this is partly why I mentioned those 2 cases, because we can't do likewise to either China or Russia from a cyber offensive operations point of view, because we don't need intellectual property from them. We don't need, we seem to have opted out from the psychological operations, at least en masse. We're not doing the same to them as they've done to others. We're not trying to target their fomented what they term colour revolution. Maybe, but I don't see it at scale. And when I've seen protests, I mean, and they've used the law. They've enacted a series of laws which they deemed calling the Ukraine war anything other than special is punishable by imprisonment. And through that, they've got the truncheons out and they've put people in jail, giving them some gentle encouragement with a fist or a baton. and with that they've suppressed opposition. Would the West want to sort of break and become like them and to engage in full, not just information operations, but an influence operation, but they could do a whole range of things. I mean, and everything Russia's been doing, and I think almost certainly proof of concept yet to be seen. We could do that and a lot more. I think capability exists with us, not with them. China's a different example, but in the Russians. But do we want to become like them? I don't know. And I don't. What I hope for, and if you look on the cybercrime front, you got the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which is imperfect, but there's 160 odd nations. It is a growing number. And Russia's, oh God, I think the FSB initially, that used to engage properly with cybercrime internationally, with policing it, because things like drugs trafficking and child exploitation, we share them in common. A little bit of counter-terrorism operations as well. We warned them about the attack in, I don't know where it was, but a major attack. It was at an opera house, I can't remember. But we warned them anyway. So there are areas and avenues for cooperation. But with that, you've got to look at the large-scale geopolitical context. I mean, there's enough problems with the UN Security Council, and sort of there are competing forces and mechanisms within that. So I wrote in my 2022 cyber warfare book about the need for a treaty-based conversation, set of diplomatic steps towards protecting things like critical infrastructure, because that is directly affecting civilians. What are the possibilities for it? Yeah, I was going to say, being a realist or being a neoliberal institutionalist will produce different answers, maybe. Steering somewhere in between. There's the reality of it's unlikely, but there's the expectation that it's for good reason that we should have these conversations. And if we don't start somewhere, then all we're doing is storing up problems and certainly not solving anything on a multiple number of fronts. And I want to live in a world of peace. I don't want to see more war. The 20th century is already one of the most destructive centuries ever. The 21st is looking worse. I don't teach and research. I don't care about these things because I want to see more of it. I want to see diplomatic solutions and dialogue and consensus building. Unfortunately, I think we're ways away from that.
Thank you very much. I agree with you. Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's enough. We had great lecture and discussion, and now I pass the floor for concluding remarks for Lyudmila Vovchuk, our coordinator of the project. Lyudmila, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. So, dear listeners, unfortunately, but our time has run out. And as a summary, I'd like to say thank you very much, Professor Stoddart, and of course, everyone who today was a part of our webinars. So, but it's not finished. I'd like to say that we will continue with Alina, our work, but it will be in the second semester. We will plan start our course, which is called the European Union's Common Security and Defense Policy Challenges Related to the war in Ukraine. And we wish all who want to listen the new information about this topic. And today, thank you very much. Have a good day and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you.
See you again, Victor.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.